Hi, welcome back, and today we're in chapter 16 on what are called the liquid verbs, and this chapter is not really all that difficult, and it certainly doesn't have the difficulty level that you encountered with the participles. So we're dealing in chapter 16 with a particular class of verbs called the liquid verbs. So let's get started here. Liquid verbs. Liquid verbs end in one of the following four letters: the lambda, the mu, the nu, and the rho. These are letters we've had all the way through, and our vocabulary, we've had these words. If you take a look off to the left, we've had these words before. No real new vocabulary here. But I want you to notice something, that their stem ends in one of those four letters: lambda, mu, nu, and rho. And it's pictured here by this funny little character off to the right. He's called Sir Liquid Lemonary. And I want you to notice sort of an acrostic that we have there with the L for the lambda, the mu, the nu, and the rho. So lemonary, that reminds us of those four consonants: lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Now, let's take a look at the words here. We have iro, it ends in a rho. Balo, we've had before. I throw, ends in a lambda. Meno, I remain, abide, or continue, ends in a nu. Crino, also ends in a nu. I judge. Angelo, or one of the forms of angelo, it ends in a lambda. And then a verb, ekteno, I extend or stretch out. Each one of those words ends in one of those four consonants: lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Now, their peculiarity is this: they reject the sigma of the future and first aorist. It's not going to be found. So the four vowels here, lambda, mu, nu, and rho, are not going to be found with the sigma suffix. And this certainly affects the future tense as well as the first aorist. We've always had the sigma suffix. For example, down below, balo is the future form of balo with two lambdas. You see a slight internal change there, and there's a circumflex accent over the omega. So that's a future active indicative, first singular, I shall throw. Underneath it, you see the word agera. Now, this comes from agero, word we had all the way back in chapter 1. I raise up. Now, what happens here? Well, here is the augment. Here's our stem. There's the rho, and then we're left with the alpha. This is parsed as first aorist, active indicative, first person singular. I raised up. The sigma isn't to be found. That is the peculiarity of these liquid verbs. The sigma occurs in the future as well as the first aorist. And with these verbs, the sigma is not going to be found in these tenses. Now, you may say, when the sigma is rejected, what happens then? It will generally leave behind a couple things. There may be a slight stem change. In the aorist, you're going to be left with the alpha in the first aorist active or first aorist middle. That alpha is still going to be there. And then you're going to often have a circumflex accent is going to be used in the future tense. So, for example, here is the future active indicative of meno. Let's pronounce it here. Meno, menes, mene, menumen, meneta, menusi. All right, just a little variation from what you've had. I want you to notice in the singular endings, all of them have the circumflex accent. When we had meno in the present, there was an acute accent right over the epsilon, right here. It was meno with the acute accent over the epsilon. Then take a look at the future. We see a little shift of ending here. We have menumen instead of amen. We have meneta instead of eta. And here in the third person plural, we have the omicron upsilon, and then there's the circumflex accent. So we notice here the circumflex accents and then some slight spelling changes. With these verbs, everything else stays the same. That's the good news. Only the future and first aorist are affected since both tenses have the sigma suffix. So a memory aid for the whole. Liquid luminaries, so that helps us with lambda, mu, nu, and rho. He waters his lemons at night, not when the sigma sun is shining above. The second point, observe his binoculars around his neck, and also he's holding on to one arrow for first aorist. So that helps us here that the liquid verbs, their change is affected both in the future and also the first aorist. And then, as you can see, the alpha is retained. You see him holding the alpha there with his one arrow. And then you see the axe that got sent by his foot. That's an accent, a little accent change or an internal change. And here we look at his big, heavy waistline there. So let's go through the picture again. Liquid verbs, they end in one of those four letters, lambda, mu, nu, and rho. Lemonary helps remind us of that. His binoculars, an arrow for future and aorist. And the sigma sun is gone. It's off the picture. It won't be found. So you'll see that the alpha is retained in the first aorist, and the reaction of the sigma getting kicked off is usually an accent, and you'll see the axe that got sent right over here, or an internal change. So that's chapter 16 in a nutshell. So let's take a look at the forms here. We have angelo. This is the form without any of the prepositions attached to it. We take a look at the future and the first aorist here. And again, with the liquid verbs, we're only concerned with the second principal part and the third principal part. Everything else really stays the same. And you'll see off to the right, when there's some blank spaces, it simply means that word isn't going to be found in that particular tense or voice. So angelo with two lambdas in the future becomes angelo with one lambda. You'll see the one lambda there, and you'll see the omega with the circumflex accent. Look at the first aorist, angela. Well, there's an augment at the front with the eta. There's a little bit of a spelling change, and then we are left with the alpha. So that's first aorist, active indicative first singular. I announced. Iro, I take up. Look and see what happens in the future. Slight internal change, and there's a circumflex. Ro, I shall take up. And then the first aorist, era. I took up or took away. Balo becomes balo in the future. Notice that we drop one of the lambdas, and there is the omega with the circumflex accent. And we already had this word in chapter 8 with the second aorist, ebalon. That was kind of our paradigm verb for the second aorist. Egero, I raise up. All right, take a look at the future. Egero. We lose an iota. There's the omega with the circumflex accent. And in the first aorist, here's our augment, here's our stem, and then we're left with the alpha ending. So here we're left with the prefixed augment and then the alpha, I raised up. Now the verb ekteno really is a compound verb from ek plus teno. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. Take a look and see what happens in the future. Ekteno. Here we are missing an iota, and then we see the omega with the circumflex accent. So that's a future. Now in the first aorist, here's the augment. It occurs after the preposition and before the verb stem. Exetena. So we have an augment, and then we are left with our alpha. So that's first aorist, active, indicative, first singular. I extended or stretched out. Krino, I judge. Look and see what happens in the future. Krino. The only difference here is the circumflex accent in the future. And then the first aorist, here's our augment, and here's our alpha. So that's translated, I judged. Meno, I remain or continue or abide. Look in the future. Meno. We're just left with the omega with a circumflex accent. And then in the first aorist, here we have an epsilon, a little bit of an internal change there, and then we're left with our alpha ending. So that's a first aorist, active, indicative, first singular. I remained. And stello, you know the verb apostello. This is also a compound verb. But notice here in the future, we lose one of the lambdas. Here's our omega with a circumflex accent. And here's our first aorist. We see our augment, and then we're left with the alpha off to the right. So that would be first aorist, active, indicative, first singular, I sent. All right, some parsing practice here for you. And then we'll come back and compare notes. All right, let's compare our findings here. Egere, this is a future, active, indicative, third person singular. He, she, or it will raise up. Apostelle, from apostello, had two lambdas in it, liquid verb, future, active, indicative, third person singular. He will send or she will send. Aaron, from airo, there we have an augment and then we have an alpha. So first aorist, active, indicative, third person plural. They took away ton kurion, the Lord, ektu nemeu, from the tomb. Ha egeros. All right, here we have a participle. Participles that are aorist also reject the sigma suffix. So what we're left with here is the alpha. So this is a first aorist, active participle, masculine singular nominative. In the attributive position, the one who raised. Apekrinata. All right, here's our augment. And then we see our alpha there, ata. So this is a first aorist, deponent, indicative, third person singular. He, she, or it answered. Hoi menantes. All right, we have a slight change of the stem, and take a look at the alpha here. This is a first aorist, active participle, masculine, plural, nominative. The ones who remained. And the last one, kai euthus, and immediately, aras. This is from airo. And this is an aorist, active participle, masculine, singular, nominative. So having taken up ton krabaton, the pallet, meaning his pallet, exeothen, he went forth. All right, you do a little work here, and then we'll compare our translations. Okay, our translation, number one, the scribes remained in the great city 3 years. Emenon, first aorist, active, indicative, third person plural. Notice the augment and the alpha. The second one, 3 years. Esosen with the subject ha basalus, the king saved the friends of the priests, and then we have tone, menon tone. First aorist, active participle, masculine plural genitive. Who remained in the village. And the last one, we glorify the one who sent the Son. Now, apostelanta, this comes from apostello with 2 lambdas. There's a slight change of stem. We lose a lambda, and here's our alpha. So we glorify the one who sent the Son. First aorist, active participle, masculine, singular, accusative. And a couple more, you do your practice, and then we'll compare. All right, the first one, eon pistueta. If you should believe in Jesus, and then you have your verb, meneta, future, active, indicative, second person plural. You will abide or remain with him, eiston iona, into the age or forever. The second one is a question. Pate, when will you announce? Angeleta, future, active, indicative, second person plural. So when will you announce the forgiveness of sins to the 3 true priests in order that they might find, hero sin, that's a second aorist, active, subjunctive, third person plural. In order that they might find the living water, zone there is a present active participle. Neuter, singular, accusative, and it's modifying water. So the living water. Kai piosi, this is a second aorist, active, subjunctive, third person plural, and might drink from it. And finally, if in you should remain the word. So if the word should remain in you, mene is an aorist, active, subjunctive, third person singular, which you heard from the beginning. Even you in the Son and in the Father, meneta, future, active, indicative, second person plural. You will remain. So thanks, and we're well on our way. And by the way, we're through the majority of Greek grammar, so you can give yourself a pat on the back.